The beam from my flashlight barely reached the far wall of the chamber. Dust floated in the air like thin fog undisturbed for years. Then I saw them, two shapes, seated side by side against the rock, still as statues, their heads tilted toward each other. It looked almost peaceful, the way their hands rested close, like they'd just leaned back to rest. But the silence in that mine was the kind that doesn't let you breathe. Even now, all these years later, I can still hear it, the sound of nothing at all. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from, and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Back in the summer of 2011, life in Grand Junction moved slow the way desert towns tend to. The heat settled heavy over the valley, the air dry enough to crack paint. Mornings smelled faintly of dust and diesel from the trucks that rolled through Main Street, and by noon the asphalt shimmered like glass. I was still volunteering part-time with Mesa County Search and Rescue, then retired from full duty but close enough to lend a hand when someone got lost in the backcountry. Sarah and Andrew back then, I only knew them through the flyers, were one of those couples you'd see in town now and then, loading up gear looking like the weekend was their world. They weren't seasoned explorers or adrenaline junkies, just two young folks trying to breathe outside city air. They had that energy you see in couples who haven't learned to fear time yet. Andrew worked with his hands. Sarah saw the world through her camera lens. You could tell even from their photos later that they saw beauty where most of us just saw empty space. That Friday, they packed up before dawn. Their old tan Subaru pulled out of Denver, heading west, back seats filled with sleeping bags and a cooler. Sarah sent her sister Linda a quick text before they lost signal. "We're heading out. Be back Sunday. Love you." There was nothing ominous in it. No tension or hesitation. Just a note between sisters. That part of Utah isn't built for comfort. Once you pass Moab and the tourist trails fade, the land goes quiet in a way that unnerves you. Old uranium mines dot the hillsides. Black mouths swallowed by dust and time. Locals don't go near them much anymore. There are warnings nailed to fence posts half buried in red sand, but tourists see the rusted machinery and think it's adventure. Still, the desert draws people. It's open, endless, beautiful in a harsh sort of way. I understood why they chose it. Saturday passed like any other August weekend. The town buzzed with the county fair kids running around with melted ice cream on their hands. I remember helping a neighbor fix a fence, the smell of hot creosote rising from the posts. That evening, the sun burned low and red behind the book cliffs, and the radio played an old Willie Nelson song. It was an ordinary night, one that should have meant nothing, but looking back, it was the last one anyone spent not worrying about those two. Sunday evening came and went. For most folks, that meant folding lawn chairs getting ready for the work week. But at Sarah's family home in Denver, Linda started checking her phone more often. Her sister was never late. She'd always text on the drive home. By 10 p.m., Linda was pacing her apartment, refreshing her messages, convincing herself there was no signal in the canyons. Still, that silence had a weight to it, the kind you can feel pressing on your ribs before you know why. By Monday morning, she called their workplaces. Neither Sarah nor Andrew had shown up. Their boss hadn't heard a word. That's when she called the local police, and the file started possible missing persons. I didn't know any of this yet, not until Sheriff Daniels called me that afternoon asking if I could spare a few days to help look. He said 2 hikers from Colorado were overdue near the old uranium fields. He sounded calm the way we all do when we think it's just car trouble or a busted tire. That night, as the sun sank behind the mesas, I checked the gear in my garage boot's GPS first aid kit spare fuel. The desert was cooling fast, the air sharp and clear. Out on the horizon, the red rocks turned purple in the fading light. I remember thinking they'd probably turn up by morning, embarrassed but fine. People underestimate the desert, it hides its edges too well. But when you've lived near it long enough, you know it doesn't forgive mistakes. I drove out early Tuesday to meet the team near Crescent Wash, about 60 miles east. The road cut through miles of silence. Nothing but sagebrush sand and power lines that stretched toward nowhere. I kept thinking about that text Sarah had sent, "We'll be back Sunday." 4 words. Harmless. But promises echo louder when they're broken. At the base camp, volunteers gathered around a folding table where a printed map flapped in the wind. Sheriff Daniels briefed us, tracing his finger across the faded mining roads. "They could have gone anywhere along here," he said. "Their families said they planned to camp near the old mines, maybe take photos." He tried to sound hopeful, but I saw the look in his eyes. He'd been out there before, knew what it meant when time and temperature started stacking against you. That night, I slept in the back of my truck, windows cracked open to let in the desert breeze. The stars above Utah have a way of humbling you. They hang low, heavy, endless. I thought about the couple somewhere out there under that same sky. Maybe their car had broken down. Maybe they were hiking for help. At that point, all of us still believed there'd be a rescue, not a recovery. The next morning, search teams fanned out across the dry washes, their voices carrying over the radio negative visual moving east. I walked an old mining track for hours, the sun baking the back of my neck, every footprint in the sand, stirring false hope. But what I remember most wasn't what we found, it was what we didn't. No tire marks, no tent stakes, no scraps of fabric. Nothing to tell us they'd ever been there at all. By sunset, the sheriff called everyone back in. The heat faded fast, replaced by a thin chill that creeps up from the stone after dark. We ate quietly, too tired to talk much. The wind picked up, and somewhere out in the distance, a sheet of old metal rattled against rock, a hollow sound that went on longer than it should have. I remember looking up from my coffee, listening. It was probably nothing. Out there, everything makes noise at night. But something about that sound stayed with me. I didn't know it then, but it came from the same direction we'd be searching again 8 years later, after the desert decided to give back what it had taken. That night, before I crawled into my sleeping bag, I looked out over the plain one last time. The moon had risen pale and thin, spilling silver light across the red rock. A single car sat parked near the edge of camp hazard lights, blinking faintly against the dark. For a moment, I thought of the couple's car somewhere out there, maybe just over the ridge. I told myself we'd find it by morning. But the lights kept blinking slow and steady until the desert swallowed them whole. I barely slept that night. The wind pressed against the side of my truck, making the metal groan now and then, and somewhere far off I could still hear that rattling sheet of tin. When morning came, the desert looked the same as it always did, vast, endless, indifferent. We gathered before sunrise, quiet men and women sipping coffee that tasted like burnt earth, waiting for Sheriff Daniels to lay out the plan. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it had changed. The families had arrived in town the night before. Sarah's sister Linda was staying with the local deputies, pale and sleepless, hoping for news she already feared wouldn't come. There's always that moment in a missing persons search when optimism gives way to something else, something quieter, heavier. That's where we were that morning. The sheriff split us into pairs, handed out radio channels, and told us to stay within 3 miles of our assigned zones. The desert plays tricks on distance. A ridge that looks half a mile away can take hours to reach. My partner that day was a young volunteer named Ben. We set out west, following an old mining road that hadn't seen a vehicle in decades. It wound through shallow canyons and dry creek beds, the kind of terrain that eats footprints and swallows tire tracks. The sun came up hard and white, and by noon the air shimmered with heat. Every now and then we'd stop and scan the horizon. You don't realize how big nothing can be until you're standing in the middle of it. Around midday, we reached a stretch of the old uranium fields. Rusted equipment lay scattered across the sand, twisted steel frames, collapsed sheds, a few cracked barrels half buried in dust. It looked like the bones of a forgotten town. Ben and I searched on foot, calling their names now and then, though we both knew sound doesn't travel far out there. Our voices just fell flat against the heat. We found no campfire rings, no footprints, no discarded wrappers. If they'd passed through the desert, had erased every trace. I remember wiping the sweat off my neck and thinking about Sarah's camera, wondering what pictures might still be on it, wherever it was. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped suddenly. Clouds rolled in from the west, a strange thing for August. We started heading back toward base when the radio crackled. A pilot's voice came through, breaking up in static, something about a reflection, maybe metal. Everyone stopped what they were doing. The sheriff ordered us to hold position while the chopper made another pass. Minutes later, his voice came back clearer this time. He'd spotted a vehicle looked like a light-colored sedan, possibly their car, about 5 miles north of our position near an unmarked road leading toward the mines. We drove there as fast as the terrain allowed, engines bouncing over the washboard track. When we crested the last hill, we saw it. A tan Subaru parked crooked in the middle of a faded trail that dead-ended into open rock. From a distance, it looked almost ordinary, like someone had just pulled over to stretch their legs. But when we got closer, the details started to speak. The hazard lights were flashing, weak, pulsing, nearly dead. The battery must have been running for days. The car doors were unlocked. Inside it looked like someone had left in a hurry, but not in fear. 2 bottles of water, one empty, a folded paper map on the seat. Andrew's phone lay in the glove compartment, screen dark but charged. The keys were gone. Sheriff Daniels arrived within the hour, his truck kicking up dust. He stood beside the car for a long while before speaking. "No signs of struggle," he said quietly. "Tank's bone dry. They ran out of gas. We all looked out at the horizon. Nothing but sand and stone. They might have gone for help, I offered." He nodded. "Maybe." Then he pointed at the GPS unit still fixed to the dash. Its screen was cracked, but working a faint line of pixels showing a route that led farther out into the desert, straight toward one of the old mine clusters. We followed that line on foot. The trail was barely visible, half swallowed by sand winding between low hills. It was late afternoon now, the light turning that sharp golden color that makes every shadow look like it's hiding something. After about 2 miles, we reached the end, a narrow cut into the rock framed by warped boards and rusted metal. An old mine entrance. The air coming from it was cold and stale, like breathing through stone. We called their names. The sound went in and didn't come back. You can always tell when a place doesn't want you there. That's how this one felt. The sheriff ordered us not to enter without proper gear. Mines like these collapse without warning, or worse, they hold pockets of gas that can kill you before you hit the ground. We searched the area outside, checked for footprints, scraps, anything. The wind was picking up again, scattering sand across our boot prints before we'd even moved on. By nightfall, the light was gone, and with it the small spark of hope we'd carried all day. Back at camp, everyone spoke in half sentences. We'd found their car, but no sign of them. It made no sense. If they'd run out of gas, why leave the vehicle? Why walk miles toward an abandoned mine in August heat? No one said the word dead, but it hung in the air anyway. The sheriff promised we'd keep searching at first light. The next few days blurred together. We expanded the grid, brought in more volunteers, even dogs. The air smelled of sagebrush and gasoline from the ATVs crisscrossing the plains. Helicopters swept the area, their blades chopping the silence into pieces. Nothing. It was as if Sarah and Andrew had stepped off the edge of the map and kept walking into another world. Linda stayed near the command post most of the week, pacing, clutching her sister's photo. I tried to comfort her, once said something useless about how strong people can be. She looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Sarah's not reckless. She wouldn't just vanish." I didn't know how to answer that. She was right. People don't just vanish. But after enough years doing this work, you learn that the desert doesn't owe explanations. By the 6th day, resources were thinning. Volunteers had jobs to return to. The county couldn't keep helicopters in the air forever. The sheriff called for one final full sweep. We covered every ravine, every patch of scrub within 10 miles of the car. I remember climbing a ridge that afternoon and looking out across miles of nothing. From up there, the world felt too big for 2 missing people to matter. Still, we tried. That evening, when the last of the light had drained from the sky, the pilot radioed in again. He'd caught a faint reflection off something metallic, a flash like sunlight hitting glass. It wasn't far from where we'd found the car. We rushed over, thinking maybe it was a piece of their gear. But when we arrived, it was just an old oil drum half buried in sand, its lid loose, spinning a little in the wind. We stood there in silence, realizing that hope was slipping through our hands faster than daylight. By the end of the week, the official search was suspended. The sheriff made the call reluctantly. He stood in front of the volunteers and said the words none of us wanted to hear. "We've done all we can." People began packing up their gear. Some lingered, looking back toward the horizon like maybe the desert would change its mind. I stayed until the last truck left. The only thing left behind was a small wooden cross someone had driven into the ground near the trailhead. Over the next few months, the story faded from the news. The families hired private investigators, retraced our routes, posted flyers that curled and bleached in the sun. I checked updates when I could, but there was never anything new. Every once in a while, someone would claim to have seen a couple hitchhiking near the state line or camping near the canyons, but every lead dissolved like mirage water. Time moved on. Years passed. The desert reclaimed its silence. The mines stayed empty, their entrances yawning open like forgotten mouths. The road where we'd found their car was washed out after a storm, and the county stopped maintaining it. Life went back to normal or something like it. But I never drove that direction again. Not until 2019, when a deputy called me one evening and said there'd been a discovery near the same site. He didn't say what not over the phone, just that it looked connected. His voice had that same quiet edge I'd heard from Daniel's 8 years earlier. I drove out the next morning through the same stretches of red earth and sky that had once held so much uncertainty. The old mine was sealed now, welded shut with a sheet of metal. Locals said scavengers had been cutting it open for scrap when they found something behind it, something that made them drop their tools and run for the truck. By the time I arrived, the area was cordoned off. Deputies stood near the entrance, their faces pale beneath their hats. I didn't have to ask what they'd found. The air itself told me. Cold, still heavy. The same air that comes from deep underground from places the light hasn't touched in years. I stood there a long time staring at that dark hole in the rock, listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the metal. It was the same sound I'd heard that first night, the rattle of steel against stone. Only now I knew it hadn't been the wind. It had been a door closing. And behind it, Sarah and Andrew had been waiting all along. The mine sat out there in the heat like a wound the desert had tried to heal over, and failed. Deputies were still setting up lights when I arrived. You could hear the hum of the generators from a half-mile away, that steady mechanical heartbeat echoing across the flats. I stood near the edge of the yellow tape, watching men in heavy gloves and masks move in and out of the shaft carrying sealed bags one at a time. 8 years of dust and silence had been peeled back, and what they found inside didn't belong to this century. When the medical examiner finally walked past me, his face gray under the brim of his hat, he didn't have to say a word. I already knew. Sarah and Andrew had been there the whole time. I'd thought I'd made my peace with the unknown, but seeing those bodies come up from the ground, that quiet proof that hope had been wasted, did something to me I still can't explain. The autopsy reports came in days later. I drove into the sheriff's office when Daniels called. He handed me a thin folder, the kind that looks harmless until you open it. The pages were filled with words like preservation fractures, no external trauma. The technical language of death. What stuck with me most was one line buried halfway down the page: bilateral fractures to the tibia and fibula consistent with fall injuries from height. I read it twice. They'd fallen. That much was certain. But how they ended up sitting side by side, their clothes still neat, their faces turned toward the same dark wall, it didn't fit any pattern of accident or panic I'd ever seen. I'd seen lost hikers' bodies curled under rocks or sprawled where they fell, but never like this. Never two people who looked like they'd simply decided to stop breathing together. We went back out to the mine a few days later. The forensics team had cleared the main chamber and they let me walk through with them. The air was bitter cold and carried the smell of iron and dust. My flashlight beam caught the glitter of mineral veins on the walls, little threads of silver light twisting through stone. You could see the faint outlines where Sarah and Andrew had sat, marks in the dust, two shadows etched into the floor. Above them, about 15 feet up, was a narrow opening that led straight to the surface. The sides were jagged, but it was a clean vertical drop. If you looked up through it, you could see a slice of sky. That was probably the last thing they ever saw in daylight. I tried to picture it, the fall, the shock, the moment they realized they couldn't move. Their legs broke in pain radiating through bone. The sound of breathing in the dark. Maybe they called for help until their throats went dry. Maybe they didn't say anything at all. The oddest thing was the metal sheet that had sealed the side entrance. It wasn't random debris. It had been welded there, fused tight against the rock. I remember crouching down beside it, running my hand over the blackened seams. The edges were too clean to be old work. This was done by someone who knew what they were doing. The sheriff said it out loud first. It was welded from the inside. I didn't respond. I just kept staring at the welds, thinking about how that meant whoever sealed it had been in there with them. The team looked for any sign of tools, a generator, anything that could have powered a welder, but the mine was bare. Just rock and silence. If someone had sealed that door and gotten out, they hadn't done it through here. They'd had another way. Daniels called a meeting the next morning in town. He laid out the diagrams of the old mining network, most of it dating back to the 1950s, and started tracing lines with his pen. The shafts ran for miles, some connecting, some dead-ending into collapsed chambers. Only a handful had been mapped in detail, and most of those records were locked up in private archives. He looked tired, older than I remembered. Whoever did this, he said, knew these tunnels. They knew exactly where to go and what not to touch. That narrowed the field in one sense and widened it in another. Out here, half the men over 50 had worked the mines or scavenged their remains. But there was a particular kind of person who'd know how to move through them without getting lost and who'd have access to welding gear. In the days that followed, the investigation turned up nothing new, just a growing pile of contradictions. No evidence of robbery, no personal motive, no signs of assault. Toxicology showed no poison, no gas exposure. Every theory we tested died in its own logic. If they'd fallen by accident, how had the door been sealed? If someone had trapped them, how had that person vanished without leaving so much as a footprint? The desert has a way of covering its secrets, but not that completely, unless it's helped. I spent a lot of nights on my porch after that, staring at the horizon where Utah melts into Colorado. There's something about distance that keeps you awake, the thought that answers are just out of reach, waiting in a place you can't quite see. I started rereading the old case file from 2011 page by page, looking for any name that stood out. That's when I noticed a note from one of the early search maps, mine access leased to private owner. Geological survey rights pending. It was a small detail nobody had followed up on at the time. I called Daniels the next morning, and he said he'd already seen it too. The county records showed that a man named Raymond Holt had been leasing that parcel since the late 90s, a retired geologist living alone on a ranch about 30 miles north. We drove out there 2 days later. The property sat at the end of a dirt road lined with barbed wire and cottonwoods bent from the wind. Holt came to the door when we pulled in, a tall man with gray hair and the kind of face that doesn't give much away. He didn't seem surprised to see us. Daniels asked if he knew about the mine where the bodies were found. Holt said yes, it was part of his lease, but he hadn't been out there in years. His voice was calm, almost bored, but when he said he hadn't been out there, he looked past us instead of at us. The sheriff asked if he still had equipment for welding or metalwork. He hesitated, then nodded toward an old barn. "There's some tools," he said. Inside the barn, dust hung in the air like smoke. There was a workbench covered in rusted saw blades, coils of wire, a few gas tanks, and a welding rig that looked well used but recently cleaned. Hanging from a nail near the back wall was a set of heavy keys, each one stamped with numbers that matched the gate locks on the mine properties. On the table beside it lay a rolled-up sheet of yellowed paper. When Daniels unrolled it, we both went still. It was a hand-drawn map, detailed precise, showing not just the main tunnels, but narrow ventilation shafts and side exits no official record had ever listed. One of those shafts connected directly to the mine where Sarah and Andrew had been found. Another led to the surface nearly a mile away. Holt's voice came from behind us. "Those are old surveys," he said flatly. "They're worthless." But his hands were shaking slightly. Daniels turned to him. "Raymond, did you seal that entrance?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough to hear the wind scraping dust against the barn walls. Finally, he said, "They were trespassing." His tone was low, almost defensive. "That land's private. I put signs up years ago." Daniel stepped closer. "So you saw them?" Another pause, then a small nod. The story he gave us was simple in words, but rotten underneath. He said he'd been patrolling his land that day, heard shouting near one of the pits, and found them down inside, injured. He claimed they'd fallen through an old shaft he'd covered years earlier with boards to keep livestock out. He said they were alive when he left, that he didn't mean to hurt anyone, but they shouldn't have been there. Then, in the same steady voice, he admitted he came back later with his welding gear. He said he secured the entrance so no one else would wander in, as if sealing two people inside was the same as locking a gate. Daniels didn't speak for a long time after that. You could see the disbelief settling over him, the way his jaw clenched like he was trying not to show it. Finally, he said, "You welded it from the inside." Holt shrugged. "That's the only way to do it right." It was that answer, calm, matter-of-fact, that chilled me more than anything. There was no anger in him, no remorse. Just a man explaining how he'd fixed a problem on his property. We arrested him that afternoon. As we drove back toward town, the sun was sinking low, casting that red haze across the cliffs again. I remember looking out at the land, at all the places where the ground dips and rises, and thinking about how many secrets could still be out there, sealed behind stone and silence. I thought about Sarah's sister, about how she'd waited 8 years for answers, only to learn her sister had died not from misadventure, but from someone's indifference. That night after giving my statement, I stopped by the river outside town. The water was low, gliding past in slow ripples under the moonlight. The desert was quiet again, as if it had finally exhaled. But I knew we weren't done. Holt's confession explained what happened, not why. There's a difference between understanding an act and believing it. And in all my years of searching for the lost, I'd never found anything as hollow as the reason he gave. He said he was protecting his land, but looking out across that empty country, it was clear he hadn't protected anything, not even himself. When they took Raymond Holt into custody, the desert had already gone dark. The red light from the patrol car spun across his front porch, catching the edges of his face in a slow rhythm. Bright, then gone bright, then gone. He didn't fight, didn't argue, didn't even ask why. He just stood there with his hands still, eyes lowered as though the whole thing was an inconvenience he'd been expecting. Daniels read him his rights, voice steady, though I could hear the strain behind it. There's something unnatural about arresting a man who doesn't show an ounce of surprise. I remember the night air smelled of dry hay and oil from the barn, and for the first time since we'd found the bodies, I felt the sharp awareness of what we were really dealing with. Not a mystery anymore, but a man. And that somehow was worse. Inside the station, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder than usual. Holt sat at the end of the interview table, wrists resting gently on the metal the way a man might sit through a routine meeting. His hair was neatly combed, his boots clean like he'd prepared himself for company. Daniels started slow talking about the land, the mines, the old survey leases. Holt answered every question with the same flat calm until the sheriff asked why he hadn't told anyone about the pit he'd covered. That's when something in him twitched, barely visible, but it was there. "It was my land," he said. "I put those boards down years ago. Anyone with sense would have seen the signs." His voice never rose. He didn't curse or ramble. It was the kind of cold reasoning you only hear from someone who's convinced themselves they did nothing wrong. When we showed him the diagram we'd found in his workshop, the one mapping every passage, every secret tunnel, he looked at it like it was a grocery list. "That's mine," he said. "You can't take that." Daniels didn't flinch. "You drew it." "Of course," Holt said. "Had to. You can't work the land without knowing what's underneath." Then Daniels asked the question we'd all been circling around since the beginning. "You welded that door shut from the inside. How'd you get out?" Holt stared at him for a long time before answering. "There's another way out. A ventilation shaft. Comes out near the ridgeline. I've known about it for years." His tone was matter-of-fact, like he was describing the weather. Daniels leaned in closer. "So you went in there, saw them alive, and left them to die." The silence that followed stretched so long I could hear the old clock ticking on the wall. Holt finally said, "They were trespassing. I secured the property." There was no confession of murder, not the way television makes you expect it. Just the smallest acknowledgement he'd seen them hurt and helpless and decided their lives didn't matter enough to save. I felt the anger move through me slow, like a current under ice. Daniels shut his notebook and walked out of the room without saying another word. I stayed a while longer studying Holt's face. I wanted to see some sign of guilt, some crack in the calm, but there was nothing. He looked like a man who'd fixed a leak in his roof. That night after he was booked, I drove home in silence, headlights cutting through miles of empty desert. I kept thinking about those last moments in the mine, the sound of welding echoing through the tunnels, the smell of burned metal, the darkness closing in. The trial came a few months later. The courtroom was small, one of those older ones with wooden pew benches and ceiling fans that clicked with every turn. The families sat on one side, quiet hands folded. Sarah's sister Linda looked thinner than I remembered, her eyes fixed on the floor most of the time. On the other side sat Holt in the same kind of flannel shirt he'd worn that first day, his posture straight, his expression detached. The prosecution didn't need theatrics. The evidence was simple and steady: the map, the welding seams, the autopsy report. His own words. The defense tried to frame it as an accident followed by panic, a man acting irrationally, fearing legal trouble. But nothing about Holt had been impulsive. He'd taken the time to go home, load his truck, haul heavy equipment back to the site, and weld a solid sheet of metal across the only exit. Panic doesn't plan. When the verdict came down, it wasn't what most of us expected. 18 years. Not for murder, but for abandonment resulting in death. It sounded so small for what had really happened, like language itself wasn't built to carry the weight of what he'd done. I watched him as the sentence was read. He didn't blink, didn't look at the families, didn't even turn his head when the deputies came to escort him away. It was as if none of it, the trial, the verdict, the bodies belonged to him. When the doors closed behind him, Linda let out a sound I'll never forget. Not a cry, not quite. More like air leaving a person after holding it too long. After the trial, the press came and went. The case made a brief ripple on the news, a headline about 2 tourists found in sealed mine. But out here it stayed with us. The old miners who still lived in the county said they'd always known something wasn't right about Holt, that he'd gotten meaner after his wife died, that he'd stopped talking to people altogether. Some claimed he'd chased hunters off his land with a rifle. Others said he'd just gone quiet. The truth, as usual, was somewhere between. He'd been living alone too long in too much silence, surrounded by too much space. And somewhere in that emptiness, his sense of right and wrong had eroded like the stone around those old shafts. I drove back to the mine once more before the state sealed it for good. It was late afternoon, the air heavy with that orange light that makes the desert look like it's burning from within. The road was rough, half washed out from rain. When I got there, the entrance was quiet again. The air still, the metal sheet still welded in place, but now marked with fresh warning signs. I stood there a long time, the sound of wind moving through the rocks like distant voices. I tried to imagine what those last days had been like, 2 people sitting together in the dark. No food, no water. Their legs shattered, realizing that no one was coming. There's no way to soften it. What he did wasn't quick. It wasn't rage. It was a slow, deliberate act that turned time itself into a weapon. As I stood there, the light began to fade, and the mine's shadow stretched long across the ground. I thought about the way Holt had justified it all, how he'd said he was just protecting what was his. I thought about the map he'd drawn, how every tunnel was labeled in neat handwriting, every path known and controlled. In his mind, that mine wasn't a place of death. It was a piece of property, something to manage. And that's what scared me most. The worst things people do often come dressed as reason. When I finally turned back toward the truck, the desert had gone quiet, except for the hum of wind through the sage. The horizon glowed faintly, the last of the daylight slipping behind the ridges. I didn't look back at the mine again. Some places don't deserve witnesses after the truth has been told. But as I drove away, the image stayed with me, the outline of that sealed door against the stone, the faint trace of welding scars still catching the light. It looked like a scar on the land itself, something that would never fully fade. Back in town, life tried to move forward. The sheriff retired not long after, said he'd had enough of unanswered questions. The families held a small memorial service near the river, and the local paper ran one last story about the case before the world moved on. But for those of us who'd been there from the beginning, it never really left. Every time I drive through that stretch of Utah, I see the color of the sand change and think of them. Sarah, with her camera. Andrew, with his quiet smile, 2 ordinary people who trusted the world to be kinder than it was. I've come to believe that evil isn't always loud or chaotic. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and utterly convinced it's doing nothing wrong. Holt will spend the rest of his life behind walls, but the desert still carries what he left behind. And sometimes on still nights when the wind moves just right, I swear you can hear the faint clang of metal against stone echoing from somewhere far beneath the surface. A reminder that what we bury never stays buried for long. After the sentencing, the town seemed to exhale not in relief exactly, but in exhaustion. 8 years of questions had finally been answered, yet nobody felt lighter for knowing. Holt was gone, locked away in a federal facility downstate. The mines on his property were sealed for good, their entrances buried under concrete. And still, every time the wind blew out of the west, people said they could smell the dry metallic tang of that place, as if the earth itself remembered. I went back to my routine after the trial, slow mornings helping the volunteer rescue team working odd jobs when they needed another set of hands. But something in me had shifted. I'd spent most of my life believing that when truth finally showed itself, it would feel like light breaking through. This one didn't. It was gray-heavy and quiet. The kind of truth that doesn't illuminate anything, it just sits there beside you and doesn't leave. Linda stayed in Utah for a few weeks after the sentencing. She came by my place once before heading home. We sat on the porch in folding chairs, coffee gone cold between us. She told me she'd been to the river where they held the small memorial for Sarah and Andrew. "It's strange," she said. "I used to picture them out there somewhere, maybe hurt, maybe lost, but alive. That picture got me through. Now I have to replace it with this." She didn't cry when she said it. She just looked tired. I told her the thing I'd told too many families before her, that knowing even when it hurts is better than not knowing at all. But as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. The sheriff's office closed the case file a few months later. They boxed everything up, photos, reports, the GPS printouts from that old Subaru, and moved it into the county archive. Daniels retired not long after. He'd given most of his life to other people's tragedies, and I think this one was the last he could take. On his last day, he came by the rescue shed to drop off a few things. He looked out toward the desert and said, almost to himself, "You do this long enough, you learn the world doesn't break in half when someone disappears. It just keeps going like nothing happened. That's the part that hurts the most." Then he climbed into his truck and drove away. Over time, the mine's story turned into something between fact and folklore. People passing through would stop in town and ask about the couple in the sealed cave the way travelers ask about ghost lights or haunted highways. The old-timers would shake their heads, say the land out there had always been cursed. I never joined those conversations. There's nothing cursed about the land, it's people who bring that kind of darkness with them. The desert doesn't choose who gets lost. Holt never appealed his conviction. He wrote one letter to the court, something about maintaining the right to his property, but it didn't go anywhere. From what I heard, he barely spoke to anyone inside. A guard told a reporter once that he spent his days drawing maps from memory, long lines and tunnels sketched over prison stationery, each one labeled in tiny block letters. They said he kept them folded under his mattress like a man who still believed his land was waiting for him. I think about that sometimes, how even in confinement he clung to control. There was no remorse in that kind of mind, only habit. The following spring, I drove out to the ridge near where we'd first found the car. The government had fenced the area off by then, but from the hill you could still see the stretch of road cutting through the dust. It looked smaller than I remembered the way places always do when time has had its way with them. The markers we'd driven into the ground during the search were long gone, swallowed by wind and rain. I sat there a long while, listening to the sound of the breeze moving through the scrub. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of the case pressing on me. Just a kind of steady low ache, like an old injury that never quite healed. I've come to understand that closure isn't a single moment. It's not the verdict or the headline or the day you pack up the files. It's quieter than that. It's walking into the grocery store months later and realizing you haven't thought about it for a few hours, then feeling guilty that you forgot. It's running into someone who asks if the bodies were really found sitting upright and deciding not to answer. It's knowing that the truth exists, but it still can't make anything right. Linda and I stayed in touch for a while. She'd send a card each year around the anniversary short notes, always ending with "thank you for not giving up." The last one came 5 years ago. She said she was engaged, that she'd finally let herself be happy again. I was glad for her. People like her deserve more than what the world gave them. I kept that card tucked into my copy of the original search map. Sometimes on quiet nights I take it out and look at her handwriting, the soft slope of her letters, and I think about how many lives ripple out from one choice, one moment, when help could have been given, but wasn't. In the years since the desert has kept on living, tourists still come for the colors, the quiet, the sense of endlessness. New families drive those same roads Sarah and Andrew once took, unaware of what happened there. The mine entrances have been filled, but the wind still finds its way through cracks in the rock. Every so often you'll catch the faint smell of rust and stone, like the earth itself breathing out what it can't hold anymore. Some nights I'll hear that sound again, metal shifting in the distance, and I'll wonder if it's just memory playing tricks or something deeper, something that refuses to rest. I never stopped volunteering with search and rescue. Every missing person case still starts the same way. Hope first, fear later. But after Sarah and Andrew, I began keeping a small notebook in my truck, 1 page for every search. I write the names, the date, and if we find them, I underline it. If we don't, I leave it blank. There are a lot of blanks. I tell myself it's not about failure. It's about remembering. Every name, even the ones without endings, deserves a line somewhere. Looking back now, I think what haunts me most isn't the cruelty of what happened. It's how ordinary it was. In the beginning, a weekend trip, a wrong turn, a stranger's decision. That's how life really changes, not in explosions, but in small moments that slip past unnoticed. I used to believe evil showed itself clearly, that you could sense it before it struck. But Holt wasn't a monster in the movies. He was a man who stopped caring about people, one boundary at a time, until there was nothing left inside him but ownership and fear. That's the kind of evil that hides best, the kind that looks like reason. Sometimes when I tell this story now, people ask why I still think about it. They mean well. They assume time heals. I usually just say, some things don't belong to time. The truth is, I think about Sarah and Andrew not because of how they died, but because of how they lived, gentle, curious, believing the world was safe enough to explore. That belief cost them everything, but it also reminds me why stories like theirs matter. It's not about tragedy. It's about responsibility, ours to each other. As I finish this, the sun's setting behind the mesa, painting the horizon in that same deep orange they must have seen on their last night. The air smells of sage and rain. The wind carries the sound of a train somewhere far off. Life goes on even here, even after everything. But sometimes when the evening light hits the rocks just right, the desert seems to hold still for a breath, as if listening. And I find myself whispering their names not out of habit, but gratitude, because in the end, remembering is the only thing that keeps any of us from vanishing completely. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.